Hi, can you hear me?
Hey, yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect.
I don't have my screen up, so okay, yep. Loud and clear. Did you find one of the hoteling spaces or whatever they are?
No, Kara booked me the BLS hub, the little conference room in the corner.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So I'm in there.
Nice.
Has the loudest clock in the world.
I hope you're not driven mad by the
Yeah.
time this is over.
I'll just be very aware of time passing. Do you have the agenda?
Yes.
I don't think I ever saw a final agenda. Do you mind just sending that to me?
Yeah, let's see here. And agenda. I always get freaked out with virtual meetings because I feel like people are more kind of like lax about their the time that they get online.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah,
I was like, oh God.
it can be kind of all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Agenda for 10-2.
Also, do I have screen sharing? Yes, I do have. Oh, no, you're gonna need to authorize me to screen share.
Let's see.
It says it's disabled.
I'm gonna make you a co-host, so I think that's
Ooh.
the easiest way, but don't get drunk with power, Ann.
I can't hear anybody. Why can't I hear anybody? Oh, that's why.
We can hear you.
There's that doesn't surprise me. It was looking a little frosty this morning for me.
There's a lot of do on the way.
All right.
Okay, and emailed that to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows, the way the webinar works is if your video is on, it means everybody else can see you, and it's including like members of the public. And if it is off, you will be seen by no one. And howdy, Jody.
Hello, Dylan. How are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Hey, Penelope.
Hi there. Nice to see you, Penny.
Well, thank you. You've been doing a great job facilitating these meetings.
Thank you. In between my hacking, I'm getting better.
Good. I'm glad you're feeling better.
Thanks.
Jody, I'll echo Penny in that, like, I actually have over the weekend thought about, like, geez, what would this be like without Jody's expertise in this and calm demeanor? So I'm just so grateful for you. And I'll echo what Penny was saying.
Back at you, Dylan. I'm your fan.
Takes a village, that's for sure.
Sure does.
All right, folks are starting to trickle in here.
Hey, Heidi, I don't think we've
Hello. Can you hear me on this headset? Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I was at a planning meeting, but I was unable to attend the actual session last time, unfortunately.
right. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Oh, no, that's fine. A lot of faces to remember.
Yeah. Nancy.
Hey, Nancy.
Hi, Jeannie.
Hi. Keep wanting to say good morning to everybody, and it's not morning. It's a Monday thing, I think. Good morning. Good morning for the week. I don't know.
Morning, Ann. How can I promote you today?
Oh, Anne, did that work for your sharing capability?
Yep, I'm good. I can share.
Great. Hey, Tom. Seeing folks trickle in here. I did want to just kind of remind folks, just because this is our first fully virtual meeting, when your video is on, that means everybody, including the public, can see you. And when your video is off, no one can see you. So it's just kind of the way it works on these webinar formats. So
For purposes of what I'm, here for in this meeting, do you need to see me? Or-
no, I think I'll be off myself as well, just to lessen the amount of Zoom screens that people are looking at.
Okay, I will probably do that as well then, so that they can focus on the people who are more actively participants.
Okay, nice
Sounds
to
like a
see you
plan.
though,
You as well.
briefly.
Okay, I didn't hear you for a while. Now I do. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I hate technology.
I'm glad we're. Oh yeah.
Dylan, I have a question. I shared my link with Rachel. Can two people get on the same link?
No. But I'll send her another copy of her link.
Yeah, and could you copy Melissa Rotten on that
Yeah.
too?
Yeah, happy to,
Okay,
Tom.
thanks.
No, thanks for the heads up.
And I'll let her know that that's coming.
Very good. It should be going to her non-legislative email, or at least that's the one I have here.
That's correct.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay, and Heidi, were you going to turn the video off or? Okay, great.
Okay, so I'm just sort of keeping track. Hi, Shelley. Seeing who we've got so far and who we're still missing. We still have a minute before start time. Jeannie, we don't yet have, well, Blueberry Commission.
I don't think Eric is going to be attending today.
Yeah,
But this is the meeting that he's
this
not.
is the meeting I think that both Eric and Holly could not make.
Interesting. I thought that it was the last meeting that they weren't able to be at, and therefore they wouldn't have had time to prep a presentation for this week, but I may be off by that.
Oh,
What
maybe,
was your
I
thought,
mean, it's
Nancy?
all a blur to me, Jody. So maybe it was last week.
Okay, let me just put this right there. We have Annie. Are you getting an echo from me?
Yes.
Is anyone on a phone that might be interfering?
I think everyone should just mute themselves.
Okay. We did reach 1 o'clock, so I can start the actual webinar if you'd like, Jody.
Just wait one moment. Is echoing still happening? Okay, awesome. Okay, yeah, why don't we get that started then?
All righty.
And do we have Heather? Not yet. Spalding? Not yet. So you may very well be right about Eric. We have Annie Watson filling in for Heath Miller. Nice to see you.
There's Eric. So you were right, Jody. Eric
Okay.
and Heidi are here. It was last time that they missed.
Great. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Hi, Eric. And do we have Holly? Oh, there you go. Hi, Holly. And Matt, there you go. Hi. Mike from Pine Tree Legal. Let's see. Yes. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Yep, thanks. And Arthur, hi. Do we have from Mono and Mono? Don't think we do yet. Okay, so we're missing Heather and Juana, and I think everyone else is with us. So let me turn it back over to you, Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner.
Hi, I'm Laura Fortman. I'm the Commissioner of the Maine Department of Labor, and it's my pleasure to be co-chairing this stakeholder group with Deputy Commissioner Nancy McBrady. I need to acknowledge upfront that technology is not my favorite way of interacting with people, and but I do appreciate the fact that it does allow folks to participate in meetings that perhaps distance and other circumstances would keep them from participating in. So I'm counting on Jody, who, as you know, has been facilitating this process to help keep me on track today and help this meeting run smoothly. But I know we have several presentations again today, and we want to dig into some information that was presented at the last meeting, but I'd like to turn it over to Nancy for a couple of comments from her.
I'll make it brief. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here for our third meeting now. And yes, we are on Zoom for the next few hours, so appreciate you all making time and turning your attention to this. Hope that we have a good discussion today in the same vein as the last two. And really with that, I think we can just really kick it off and segue to the next part of the agenda, unless Jody, you wanted to do any other housekeeping before we do that. And perhaps for the record, we go around and have everybody just introduce themselves. How about I go ahead with that? I don't see any. Oh, I will mention as well, folks, Zoom does not particularly work well for me. I catch sometimes a couple words will be missing. So if anyone and your faces get a little frozen at times, so if someone's trying to signal to me or whatnot, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not seeing it. So with that, really the best way to get my attention is to just speak my name and flag that for me. I will hand it off to the next person to introduce themselves, and then we can go tag around the video screen with everyone else suggesting the next person to introduce themselves. So I will ask Ann Macri to please introduce herself next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ann Macri. I'm an Assistant Attorney General. I represent the Bureau of Labor Standards, and I will turn it over to Penny.
I'm Penny Jordan. I'm one of the owners of Jordan's Farm here in Cape Elizabeth, and I am here representing Maine Farm Bureau. Name somebody. How's about let's see. How about Tom?
Good afternoon, all. My name is Tom Harnett, and I work in the Speaker's office. And I will turn it over to the speaker.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone. It's good to be with you today. My name is Rachel Talbot Ross, and I serve as Speaker of the Maine House. I will turn it over to, let's see, Senator Tipping.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mike Tipping, here representing the Senate, and I represent Senate District 8 in Penobscot County. I'm not sure who's gone, so I'll leave it to the host.
How about Jeannie?
Hi, I'm Jeannie Tapley. I am the Assistant Executive Director for the Maine Potato Board. The next on my screen would be Shelley McGuire.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shelley McGuire at Maine Farmland Trust. I'm glad to be here, and I will pass it over to Arthur.
Thanks, Shelley. Arthur Phillips with the Maine Center for Economic Policy, and I'll hand it off to Holly.
Thanks, Arthur. It's Holly Francis with Passamaquoddy Wild Blueberry Company. And I'll go to Eric.
Everyone, it's Eric Venturini with the Wild Blueberry Commission of Maine. I will pass it to Marianne Tarowski.
Good afternoon, everyone. Marianne Tarowski. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for Governor Mills.
How about Matt?
Hey everyone, I'm Matt Schlobohm. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine AFL-CIO. Good to be with you all. And this is test. I'll go to Mike. I don't think Mike is gone.
Hi, I'm Mike Ware from Pine Tree Legal Assistance. I'm an attorney in our farm worker unit. And let me see, I'll pass it to Sean Douglas.
Hello, this is Sean Douglas from Mono Mono.
Hi, Sean. Are you able for us to see you or not? If not, we understand, but if you are, we'd love to.
I unfortunately am not. My camera these days freezes when I turn it on with Zoom, so.
No trouble. Nice to have you. We have not heard from Heather.
Hi, everyone. Heather Spalding from Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. And I think Annie Watson hasn't gone yet.
Hi there, Annie Watson. I'm an organic dairy farmer from Whitefield, and I also serve as president of the Maine Dairy Industry Association. I'm subbing for Keith Miller today, so I appreciate you letting me come and join. I guess we have John.
Yes, hi, this is John Rio, Deputy Director of the Bureau of Labor Standards. Thank you.
And Dylan?
Hi, folks. My name is Dylan Murray. I'm the Legislative Liaison for the Maine Department of Labor. Excited to be here. Thank you.
So, and I think with that, Jody, I know we have a number of folks from the Department of Labor on this. They're here to provide support and help with some of the note-taking, but not participating in the committee.
Sure. Well, great. Then what we generally do to start out these meetings quickly is to review working agreements, just so that we have a common understanding of how we're communicating with one another and what we're trying to accomplish together. And then we'll do a quick review of the agenda and then dig right into talking about some data. So as you received early on in the process, these meetings are all open to the public. All comments are on the record. They're being recorded, and the recordings are available online on the committee's website. We're doing our best to start meetings on time, and we are always ending meetings on time, if not early. This meeting goes until 3 o'clock today. We're making every effort to attend in person when the meetings are in person, so just to facilitate communication. And where we can keep our cameras on when we're meeting remotely, we're trying to do that again, so we can see one another and remember that we are all human beings. We are doing our best to share meetings well in advance. This one was a little tricky with the meeting just 1 week earlier, but generally we're sharing materials about a week in advance to give you enough time to review them. And we're hoping that you've come prepared by having read the materials, sort of noted questions that you might have, just to make our time together most efficient. We're keeping our cell phones off and trying to keep distractions at bay, just to make sure that we get as much done as possible together, and striving to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to talk, and we share the airtime fairly equally if possible. And that we're coming here all with an open mind, hoping to learn something, eager to convey information, but hoping that we also gain a broader understanding that we might have come in with. and ultimately, we've kind of got a goal here that's articulated clearly in the executive order. So we're adopting a problem-solving orientation to achieve that goal. And where we're disagreeing, we're doing so politely or kindly, again. We're dealing with serious topics all the time. So humor is welcome, and it's not meant in any way to be disrespectful about the urgency of the issue, but just that sometimes that can make work more pleasant and actually more productive. So those are the working agreements that we agreed to at the first meeting, and really we're kind of doing a deeper dive into some of the issues that we addressed last meeting. We have a large presentation from Anne, again, highly relying on our expertise. But prior to that, you all received some data in, I believe, hard copy for those who were present at the last meeting toward the end of the meeting. And we wanted to make sure that we talked about that a little bit, made sure that there was a common understanding of what that material was, what the implications of it were. And then, the bulk of the rest of the meeting is really talking about what was gleaned from the presentation. We always have an opportunity for public input. We'll gauge how many people want to speak. And if we don't have enough time for that, we'll make sure that we solicit written comments and get those to you in the next meeting's packet. And I think that's it. If I didn't miss anything, then I might turn it back over to both of you, Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner, to talk about the data that was distributed.
Sure. There were 2 handouts, which are also posted electronically to the website and were emailed to you by Dylan, I believe. There were 2. One is relating to H2A statistics, as well as some information that was published in the 2017 Ag Census regarding labor. Commissioner Fortman, is there any preference as to which we would like to briefly highlight?
I don't think so. I think if people had any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. I do want to say just up front here that for those of you who worked with Mike Rowland, he was our Bureau Director for the Bureau of Labor Standards. Mike retired on Friday, so Mike is not with us today. I would normally turn over to him and ask him to walk through some of the data. And also our division director, who many of you also work with, Scott Cottonmore, has been out. And so he will be back hopefully later this week. But at this moment in time, I'm it for answering your questions, and I will do the best that I can. I think if you look at the charts, the thing that I took away from what we're seeing, and I'd be interested in your experiences, is that we're seeing an increase in the number of H2A applications, that the trend is not just a trend that's happening in Maine, but is happening across the country, that more and more farm workers are H2A workers. And as Anne pointed out in that first meeting when we were doing definitions, there are different regulations and requirements that govern those employees. The chart for 2023 is not done yet. You'll see that there's a little dip in the numbers for 2023 and H2A workers. It's unclear at this point in time whether that's showing a decrease this year or if we just haven't received all of the numbers yet. But I think that was the information folks have been asking for. What are we seeing? What are the trends? But I'd be interested in your experiences. Is that also what you're seeing?
Let me just jump in here for a second. How are people able to hear the commissioner? On my end, it's the audio is pretty garbled for some reason. And I'm wondering if maybe there's anything getting in the way of your mic at all. were others able to get the essence of it? Sort of maybe a thumbs up, thumbs down-ish thing?
I couldn't quite hear.
It's like a bubble. I don't know if there's something in her office that is causing speaker feedback. Because that's what it sounds like on my end is I'm hearing her twice.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Well, let me go on mute. Let me see if I can get an external mic and plug that in and see if that helps. But
Sure.
we can move on to Nancy's presentation.
Yeah.
And if there are questions, maybe put those in the chat.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, and I can just reiterate that Commissioner Fortman was drawing attention to the fact that the H-2A data provided by the Department of Labor did provide a breakdown of information about the number of requested workers relevant to specific crops, and then also some information tracking the number of employers participating in H-2A for a significant amount of time, almost 10 years. And so if there are any questions, observations that folks on the call would like to discuss, certainly happy to hear about that right now, and utilize those Department of Labor members who are here today who might be able to answer any questions about that. So again, just underscoring that Department of Labor did go back and look to see where the employment for H-2A is trending, and you can see real growth in H-2A participation over the last 8 years, quite significantly. There was an example, for instance, with respect to potatoes, that really opened my eyes. I knew H-2A work was increasing. I just hadn't realized it was so stark. And so again, the floor is open if anyone has any questions relative to Department of Labor statistics provided.
Any questions or reactions to that data? And maybe since we're all on Zoom, maybe if you wanted to speak, you just raise your hand so I can call on you. Go ahead, Arthur.
Thanks, Jody. One question that I don't know if anyone on this call can answer, but I'm curious if there's a way of determining the distinction between the number of requested workers and the number of folks who actually come through, whether that's through the state monitor advocate or any other method. The requested workers is all I've seen, and I have no sense of what percentage of those folks on average actually end up making it.
Arthur, that's a really reasonable question. Unfortunately, that is not information that is provided to us. So and the state monitor advocate does work for the Department of Labor as well. So we would have that information if it was available.
Yeah. You sound much, much clearer, Commissioner. I don't know what you did, but you solved it. Thank you for that. And I also, just as a slight divergence, I want to acknowledge there was a public member, an attendee, who did have his hand raised. And Nolan, what I just, if you do still have a question in the near term, please feel free to send a message to Dylan Murray in the near term. And then we'll make sure, if you still would like to make a public comment toward the end of the meeting, we'll make sure that we call on you. You could just raise your hand at that time. So thank you. Other committee questions about or comments about the data?
Jody, I'll just mention that very briefly, the USDA census from 2017 does collect some information about labor. And when during our first meeting, a member of this advisory committee did ask whether or not there was more information in the census that could be provided. So really, I did go through the census and just pulled out relevant tables where hired farm labor or unpaid worker statistics were captured. And that is what these 6 or 7 pages attempt to do, is just to provide that breakdown of information. I don't have a lot more to add to that other than to just explain, my interpretation is that it is allocating the labor statistics garnered from the census across a couple of different topics. For instance, the first table is showing the farms with the market value of products sold, so farms that earned $1 million or more in sales, all the way to those that have less than $1,000 in sales, and breaking out farm labor across that spectrum. So it's an enormous undertaking for agriculture, but I will just, my takeaway is USDA is really looking at, the agronomic mechanics of farms far more than they are at the labor side of things. So unfortunately, we're limited in what we can draw from the census relative to lots of labor data. If anyone has any further observations or comments beyond mine, I'm certainly willing to hear them. And if I didn't capture everything, we did post the entire 470-page census on the website for this committee as well.
You had a comment or question?
I did. Thank you, Jody. And it's a follow-up to Arthur's question. I understand that we don't know, we know how many H-2A workers were requested. We don't know how many actually ended up being employed. I'm curious if we know reasons why requests are not met. Is it due to an absence of H-2A workers, or is it determined that certain employers don't qualify?
I don't know the answer to that, Tom, definitively, but we can check into it. I'd be surprised. I'm hearing an echo now.
Yeah, something changed. But I think we got the essence.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions before we move on to Anne's presentation? Yeah, Matt.
Just one observation, and maybe I'm dense here and missing part of Arthur's question, but when I look at the data shared, it appears like for certain crops, there is clarity on how many work, like the requested number of workers, and then the last column, H-2A workers, single crop. So for example, if you look at logging, 114 workers were requested. There were 114 H-2A workers single crop. Does that mean?
No, sorry, Matt. Get reasonable question. I probably should have asked Dylan to pull up the slides so we could do that. There are actually 4 columns. The first 2 on the left that you were talking about, Matt, number requested and then number filled, and then you've got the third column that has a different number in it and a different number of workers. What that is the first 2 columns are for farmers that had multiple crops. So let's say I'm doing, broccoli and corn, and I'm filling that out in those columns. And of those, I only, there may be like 4 people who are filing under, and I don't have it right in front of me, whatever, broccoli and corn. And then if you go to the third column, there may be just like 1 farm there with the number. Those are people who are requesting H-2A for a single crop. So it's basically a subset of the first 2. Does that make sense now?
Yep. Okay. Penny, did you still have a comment or question?
I had a similar question. I was trying to figure out what that last column was. So thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, those are single crops.
Great. Anything else before we move on? Okay, let's do that. We're tracking perfectly. So why don't we shift over to Anne and pull up her presentation.
Okay, bear with me just a moment. Okay, can everybody see that?
Visible. It's great.
Hello again. My name is Anne Macri. I'm an Assistant Attorney General. You've heard an awful lot from me, and you're going to hear a little more today. Just in terms of logistics, I don't mind stopping along the way for questions if folks have questions. However, I am probably not going to be able to see you very well. So I'm going to rely on Jody perhaps to flag if someone raises their hand or someone has a question, okay?
Sure.
Okay, so last week we talked a little bit about subchapter 3, which is the section of Maine wage and hour law that includes minimum wage. And what we're going to do today is we're going to dive a little bit deeper into subchapter 3 and what it requires, as well as the other statutes that are impacted if the exemption for individuals employed in agriculture is eliminated. Okay, so we are going to talk about the contents of subchapter 3. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about minimum wage. We're going to talk about record keeping, rest breaks, and limits on mandatory overtime. Okay, so subchapter 3. Subchapter 3 is a collection of statutes. There are 11 different statutes contained within subchapter 3, but we're just going to cover the main ones. We have minimum wage, record keeping. We have one that is called unfair contracts. The entire text of that statute is on this screen here. That is the statute that essentially says that we can't contract around the requirements of subchapter 3, even if the employer and employee agree that they would like to do so. We have overtime and tips, which we are not going to cover. Overtime was the subject of a separate exemption in the last bill, and that is not within the charge of this committee. And then tips really rarely relevant. And then lastly, enforcement. In subchapter 3, there is both private enforcement, private right of action, as well as DOL enforcement through penalties and citations. Oh, keep hitting the wrong button here. Okay. So minimum wage. What do we mean when we say minimum wage? We have an hourly rate, obviously, that is part of minimum wage. Currently, it is the state minimum wage is $13.80 per hour. It will be going up to $14.15 in January. One of the things that's important to understand is that within the context of minimum wage, we look at things in a work week instance and an iteration of a work week. The work week is 7 consecutive days. And that is true regardless of how employees are paid. So you might have employees who are on a biweekly pay cycle or might get paid, twice a month. We still look at the 7-day work week. That 7 days, which 7 days they are, is subject to the discretion of the employer. But we are looking at things within the context of that 7-day period. There is not a specific method of payment that is required by minimum wage. There are a variety of different ways to calculate what is a wage. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there is no specific sort of format or method that is required. A piece rate is a form of meeting the minimum wage. We are not going to talk about that this week. We're going to get into that in much more detail at our next meeting, I believe. But I did want to flag that piece rate is a method that can currently be used as long as at the end of that calculation, the employee earns at least minimum wage for all hours that are worked. That's the relationship that we're looking at, is the payment and the time worked. Okay, so what is a wage? There is a definition of what we consider to be a wage in section 663. It includes the compensation that is paid to any employee. It must be in a legal tender, and in fact, it must be in a US legal tender. Cash is allowed. There are some states that don't allow payment in cash, but we do. Checks really doesn't matter as much, the exact form, as long as it is convertible to cash on demand, right? The employee must be able to make that payment into cash. What cannot be used, and what we see occasionally, is product, right? You can't pay someone in the form of a product, or someone getting a discount or something like that. That's not going to be considered a wage. We include within the definition of a wage the reasonable cost to the employer of providing board or lodging. And we will talk about that in much more detail in a moment. Payment can be electronic. That might mean debit cards. That might mean Venmo, PayPal. We're increasingly seeing people getting paid that way, as long as the employee can make an initial withdrawal of their entire net pay without an additional cost. Also, I will say we're going to talk a little bit more about record keeping later, but when we see payment with Venmo and PayPal, those are areas where you might have some problems with a pay statement, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about pay statements. Okay, so lodging and meal credits. Employers are allowed to take a credit against minimum wage for the reasonable cost of providing lodging or meals, as long as it is provided primarily for the benefit of the employee. So this is baked into the definition of a wage, the reasonable cost of lodging or meals. Board is meals. The employee must voluntarily accept the lodging or meals. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to accept it every single time. It can be sort of baked into the job offer, right? And that's often how it happens, that it is part of the arrangement, the job offer, and the payment terms that are made when the employee is offered the job. Record keeping is very, very important in this context. The burden is on the employer to establish that establish what the reasonable cost is, and establish the credit, essentially. And so there is an expectation that records will be kept to be able to establish what that reasonable cost is. So record keeping is very important here, and failing to have those records, maintain those records, and provide them when requested may defeat the employer's ability to take that credit.
Anne, Penny has a question.
Okay.
Yes, Anne, I know reasonable, you're getting into it a little bit more. I know reasonable cost is probably sometimes difficult to define, but is it going to include like a market price for a rental? Because that could be a lot of money in some areas.
So we're going to go into reasonable cost next. I think it depends on what you're talking about in terms of market cost. If it's the cost that the employer is paying, that may be reasonable cost. If it's sort of a lost profit, for instance, if the employer is taking let's say housing that they were previously renting and now they're providing it to their employees, and so they're sort of losing the benefit that they had of having a market rate, that is not going to be considered reasonable cost.
Good. Okay.
So we're going to go through all of that in a little bit more detail. We have some examples as well. So hopefully that will become clear. If you still have a question, let me know.
Great.
Okay. So reasonable cost. So one of the important things to understand with reasonable cost is that we are talking about cost. The employer cannot take any profit. They can't make money on the deal. This also includes affiliated persons, They can't have any profits. So sometimes this might mean family members, it might mean business partners, it could mean a related entity, a corporate entity. Generally, what we talk about with reasonable cost, it includes the cost of operation and maintenance. In housing, it can include things like utilities. It can also include a reasonable rate of depreciation. As I said, reasonable cost is not necessarily the same as fair market value or lost profit. If we have something that there is a profit at some point that the employer is now using for a different purpose, and they are charging the same rate, that may not, unless they're charging cost for their rental rate, then that is probably not gonna fly. As I said, the employer has the burden to establish the reasonable cost, and the records have to be maintained to establish that and to substantiate it. And if there are no records, then the credit might be lost. Okay. So as I said, these kinds of credits can only be taken for things that are considered to be for the benefit or convenience of the employee. And generally, meals are always going to be considered for the benefit or convenience of the employees. A lot of things may end up being beneficial to both the employee and the employer, right? That's often the case in these kinds of circumstances. So we're looking at who's getting the bigger portion of that benefit, right? Is it really more helpful to the employee? Is it really more helpful to the employer? One thing that is very important here is that if the employer is obligated in some way, whether it's legally, whether it's by benefit of an agreement, if they're obligated to provide that housing or meals, then it's considered a benefit for the employer. It's essentially a business expense of the employer, and they can't take a credit. One of the clearest examples of where this applies is in H-2A. Under H-2A, lodging and a form of meals or some access to cooking facilities have to be provided, and the employer is obligated to do that as part of the program. It's a legal obligation. So those costs cannot be taken as a credit. The other thing to remember in that context is that not only does that apply to the H-2A workers, it also applies to the other employees, the non-H-2A employees who are in corresponding employment, right? So the other folks who are doing the same work for that employer, who are not H-2A employees, because the employer is obligated to provide equal benefits, they can't take a credit in that context.
And Penny has a question for you.
Okay.
I think you just clarified it, because so farms that have H-2A as well as other seasonal workers, because through a federal program they're obligated to provide housing and transportation, a vehicle to get to the store and back, and things such as that. So therefore, if you hire workers who are non-H-2A, the rules and guidelines from the feds actually are saying that you are obligated to provide for these employees, therefore you're obligated to apply for all other employees.
If the employees are in what's considered to be corresponding employment. So basically, if you have two workers who are doing the same job, one is H-2A, one is not H-2A, yes, you have to treat those people the same. They have to be paid the same, they have to have the same benefits. And so you can't take a credit for one and take a credit and not take a credit for the other. You really can't take a credit for either of them, most likely, because the reason that you're providing those benefits is because it's required.
Okay, so then you have, and I've had these conversations with H-2A peeps as well. So then you have a seasonal employee who is actually the manager, the supervisor of the crew that is in the field, and they are also provided housing, yet they aren't doing the same job. They are not harvesting the vegetables, etc. They're just overseeing the process. So could a credit be taken for them?
Possibly. I think it would depend on the specifics of what the nature of the employment was for H-2A purposes. It would really be a question of whether they were considered to be in corresponding employment.
They wouldn't be in corresponding employment.
If they're not in corresponding employment, then you would look at that, you would look at that employee, you would look at what the benefit that was being provided, and you would go through this analysis. Is it being provided at reasonable cost, or what is the reasonable cost? And then is it provided, primarily for the benefit of the employee or for the employer?
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay. So transportation is not something that is covered under the definition of wages in Maine law. However, it is sometimes treated as an other facility under federal law. So we sort of look to that as a guideline. We may evaluate it as to whether or not it's considered work time or not, but we don't necessarily look at it through the lens of a credit. Again, when we're looking at a credit broadly, it really is a question of whether it's primarily benefiting the employee, primarily benefiting the employer. There are different types of transportation, and the different types of transportation may be treated differently. So for instance, normal sort of commute type transportation, generally going to be considered primarily benefiting employees. If it is a situation where the employees are coming to a work site and then are being transported to somewhere distant, right? Somewhere much further from the typical work site, that's generally going to be at the employer's benefit. One important caveat here is that generally with migrant or seasonal workers, this may also apply to H-2A, if there is transportation to and from the point of hire, essentially you have folks who are outside of the state of Maine or in some circumstances outside the United States, and they have to travel to Maine to the location to work, that transportation is generally going to be for the employer's benefit and therefore not eligible for a credit. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of examples because I think this is, it's somewhat complicated territory, and I think it's sort of helpful to see some particular examples. So, example one, we have a dairy farm that rents a nearby house to provide housing to its workers. The employer pays $400 a month for the house, which can house 3 workers, and the farm takes $30.77 per week as a credit against the minimum wage for each worker. Alex works for the dairy farm and earns $14 per hour. They work 35 hours a week, or 35 hours in the first week. They earn $490 gross. And then the farm deducts $30.77 for the provision of housing. That makes Alex's effective hourly wage $13.12. So even though their effective hourly wage is below $13.80, this is a permissible credit and therefore is not a minimum wage violation. And I will show you how we get to that $30.77. So you have $400 a month, multiply that by 12 months, divide it weekly, and then divide that resulting number, 9231, by 3 workers, and that reaches $30.77. So they're taking that credit per worker each week. And even though that is drawing Alex's hourly wage below $13.80, that $30.77 is part of the wage that they are being paid. And so they are meeting minimum wage.
And Tom has a question for you, or a comment.
Yep.
And then Penny.
Thank you, Jody. And it's a question. You keep using the phrase for the primary benefit, recognizing that sometimes it benefits both parties, the employer and the employee. If an employer provides housing, but the housing is very close, let's use the dairy farm example, is very close to the workplace because they want the worker to be available at all times, or particularly in case of an emergency. How do you determine who is the primary beneficiary there?
So I think housing is often going to be considered a a benefit to the employee, but it does depend somewhat on how much the cost is, right? If the amount that's being taken out, if they can much more cheaply, or they can pay rent much more cheaply somewhere else, it might not be much of a benefit to them. I think it's a somewhat case by case scenario. In this case, I didn't bake this in. I should have noted that, but we're sort of assuming that this is a benefit. They've also accepted it, right? It has to be voluntary. So if they choose not to take the housing, then they can't take the credit. The employer could not take.
Thank you for that. What if an employer knows that if they do not provide housing, they will not get workers? Who's the primary beneficiary then? I mean, it seems that the employer has to provide the housing in order to maintain their operation. Why is that a cost of business?
That's an interesting question. I'd have to research that. I'm not sure I've seen any particular scenarios where sort of that argument has been raised where, you know, you're sort of saying that they wouldn't be able to recruit employees in that circumstance. I can't answer that one off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, Tom. Before I take Penny, just if everybody else could check their mic and put yourselves on mute. There was some feedback recently, and I don't know what changed, but something changed. So go ahead, Penny.
I guess a couple of questions, and they're just things to ponder as we go through this exercise over the next several weeks. Number one, I think Tom poses a very interesting and intriguing question that I think we probably want to delve into, because I don't disagree with him that many times employers, in order to gain employees, need to have housing because there's not a huge number of people in the state that are seeking to work on farms and do the labor that we are asking of people. So, Tom, I hope you did not fall off your chair when I agreed with you.
I wasn't surprised at all, Penny. Thank you.
Number two, have we ever considered, and probably there are many people out there who are farmers who may, my phone will be ringing. Have we ever considered that the formula should take us to the minimum wage and not below the minimum wage? That we strive to not pay below the minimum wage. So I'm just throwing that out there as food for thought. So as we come down to $13.12 in your example, maybe what it should always bring us to is at a minimum of minimum wage, if that's what we're talking about. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, so what we'll make note of that without necessarily feedback on that right now, but let me move to Mike for question or comment.
A couple of quick things. One is under federal law, at least, no deduction can be taken even if a facility such as housing or transportation or anything else can be taken against the minimum wage if the facility is provided in violation of law. In other words, if there is, if the housing is substandard, even if it's for the benefit of the employer, there can be no deduction taken for it. But I think far more, given that the purpose of what this committee is doing is to focus and clarify what would change if the exemption for minimum wage being paid to farm workers is eliminated. What would change and what would remain the same? And correct me if I'm wrong, but the definition of what a wage is that we've been talking about, that already applies to farm workers. Am I right?
No, because the definition is in subchapter 3, and individuals employed in agriculture are exempt from all of subchapter 3. So what we're talking about now is if subchapter 3 applied. So all of these are examples are premised on the idea that we get rid of that exemption and subchapter 3 applies. So that definition of wage is in section 663. It's in subchapter 3. Now, there is a federal definition. There are federal regulations that are fairly similar that would apply. That, you know, in terms of the availability of credits is going to be basically the same. So that's what currently applies. Does that answer the question?
I'm just wondering if you wanted to also make any comment on Mike's comment about substandard housing.
No, that is correct. Yeah. So the provision of housing still has to meet, you know, it has to be livable housing.
Still have your hand up, Mike, or did you have additional
Well, that's
questions?
because I don't know how to turn it off. I'm sorry.
No problem. Great. All right, should we continue on to the next example?
Okay, I'll move on and then we'll see if we have questions about that. So that one is going to look quite similar.
Question?
Yes.
Ask a question, Ann.
Yep.
You mentioned how federal versus state law applies in terms of this, these different calculations that can be made against minimum wage, you know, for housing, for example, and that if, for example, we bring farm workers under state, the definition of state employees, then the state definition for these deductions would apply. But if we don't, the federal definition will apply. First, is that what you said?
The federal definition is what currently applies.
Right. So, so what are the differences?
So there aren't really substantial differences. Our definition for wage includes board and lodging. It does not include other facilities. The federal statute includes other facilities. So it's the same basic, you know, structure. It's the same reasonable cost. It's the same you know, primary beneficiary. In fact, most of what we look to in interpreting that is federal law and federal regulation.
In either case, transportation wouldn't be included because already under Maine state law, you can't use transportation, or only under the under this chapter.
So transportation really depends. Under federal law, it really depends on the type of transportation that you're talking about. It can qualify as an other facility. Under Maine law, it's a little bit, it's not specified as a part of the wage. So, you know, we would probably look to federal law in the instance that there was transportation that qualified, but it might, whether you could take a credit, maybe not.
Let's hold that thread. If there are additional questions about transportation, we'll pick them back up. Excuse me. Let's move on to example 2, and then we can come back to that if we need to.
Okay, so we have a similar example here. Dairy farm owns a nearby house. This time they own the house instead of renting it. Prior to housing the workers, they rented this house, and they rented it for $550 per month. They are their cost to maintain the house and the utilities is $400 a month. They are taking a credit of $42.31 per week as a credit against minimum wage for each of the workers. Same number, same 3 workers. Alex works for the dairy farm, earns $14 per hour. They work 35 hours, week 1, earning $490 gross, and then the farm deducts $42.31 for the provision of housing. That brings their effective hourly wage down to $12.79. This is not a valid deduction. And the reason for that is because the credit exceeds the reasonable cost to the employer. In this case, the reasonable cost is $400. They are using the lost profit number instead, but they can't profit and call that reasonable cost. They can't bake profit into it. So this is not considered to be a valid credit. And I'll show you the math here. So again, we have the cost that they're paying, or the lost profit cost divided by 12 months, or times 12 months, divided by 52 weeks, divided by the number of employees. So pause there and see if folks have any questions about that one.
Does that one make sense to folks? Any questions about that? Okay, yeah, let's move on then.
Okay. So last example, we're going to talk about meals. So we have Blueberry Farm. Blueberry Farm provides lunch to its workers 5 days a week. Farm pays a local restaurant $150 a week to provide boxed lunches for its 25 workers. The farm claims a 15-cent credit per hour based on its cost and an estimated number of hours worked each week. Farm pays its workers $13.65 per hour due to providing meals. When Dale was hired by the Blueberry Farm, they were told that the hourly rate was $13.65 and that lunch would be provided on weekdays. Dale accepted the job. Although Dale's hourly rate is less than $13.80, this is a valid credit and does not violate minimum wage. Show you the math there. So we have $150 cost divided by 25 workers, $6 a week, divided by, they're using an average of 40 hours, and that reaches 15 cents an hour. Any questions about that one?
And is that the last? Oh, go ahead. Juana, go right ahead.
I have a question. If I'm understanding correctly, all of these examples that you are saying as examples are if the minimum wage goes to effect, right? Like these are not current. Okay. So
these are not current examples. These are based on the idea that the exemption would be removed and then subchapter 3 would apply. This is what, these are sort of hypothetical scenarios in that circumstance.
So what is currently like the actual implications or rules around like meals and housing and transportation without chapter 3 going into effect?
It would be governed by federal law.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, it's essentially the same. The federal law allows taking credits for meals, lodging, and other facilities. Again, it's the question of who's the primary beneficiary, it's voluntarily accepted, and it's reasonable cost. So it's the same structure, it's the same test, basically, between state and federal law. Simply doesn't, it would not be, we could not enforce it. DOL could not enforce this right now. US DOL would have to enforce it.
If I can jump in here for a second too, it would be against the federal minimum wage though, right, Ann?
Yes, yes.
So that's the
number
big
we would be
difference.
using
It's $7.25 an hour, not against the state minimum wage.
Right.
But the rest of the structure is the same.
Yes.
So it would be the same. So nothing would change. The only thing that would change would be that the minimum wage would be against the state minimum wage, and that the state now has to implicate it. Whereas right now, the state doesn't have to implicate it, and the minimum wage is to the federal wage. Is that right?
Right. So if someone came to DOL now and said, I work on a farm, they're taking, housing out of my pay. If they came to Maine DOL, we would have to tell them, you're not subject to the minimum wage statute at the moment. And we would have to send them to the US DOL. But the question of whether or not the employer could validly take that credit is really the same. It's really the same question. It's really the same answer. It's just who can enforce it.
And it's the same calculations.
Basically, yes. Yeah. I mean, these are various examples, right? So I don't know that these would be the exact calculations. But in terms of, you're looking at what is the reasonable cost that's being taken? Is it a primary beneficiary benefit to the employee versus the employer. Is there profit involved? Are they just taking the actual cost? All of those are the same criteria.
Other questions that either this example generates, or kind of more broadly about these credits? Okay, then let's move on through the rest of this slide deck, and then we can pause and take have a broader conversation.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about record keeping. So I think record keeping is an important thing to talk about after these examples, because again, establishing and maintaining the records to identify what the reasonable cost is an important part of being able to take those credits. So there is a statute within subchapter 3 that covers record keeping. This is section 665. We talked about this a little last week. So I'm not going to go into detail on this, but basically we have hours worked, wages paid, and then the detailed pay statement that has to be provided that includes hours, total earnings, itemized deductions. Those pay statements can be electronic as long as the employee has the ability to access the statement and can print it without a cost. I know there was some question last week about sort of the interaction between the two record keeping statutes, 622 and 665. So I thought it might be helpful to sort of put them side by side. And so really, they are covering the same territory. Again, with 665, because it's in subchapter 3, remember when I said earlier today that we look at that in the context of the work week. So really, we're looking for those records, again, kind of in that context of a work week. 622 is daily records, but those should be the same thing, right? You should have daily records that then add up to what the weekly records should look like.
And can you please remind people what section 622 is?
So 622 is the other record keeping statute that is in Titles 26, Chapter 7 that we talked about. It's one of the statutes that already applies. It's not covered by the current exemption. It is similar to 665, the records that are required to be kept. And you can see on the left side here what is required by section 622. So I do want to flag both of these do not apply to salary exempt employees. When we say salary exempt employees, we're talking about employees who meet one of the duties tests. Professional, administrative, executive. You might have managers who might be salary exempt. Any questions about that before I move on?
Hi, Ann, I've got a question. First, I apologize that I wasn't able to make the last meeting, and perhaps this was discussed then. But we heard early on that the Bureau, DOL, wasn't really able to inspect a lot of the records of employers, and that that might be part of the reason why this effort to bring them under the statute and remove the exemption from the state employees definition. But what I'm seeing here is there's these record keeping requirements, as you said, that already exist under statute. It sounds like section 622. So because am I right that agricultural workers, agricultural employees of ag workers are required to keep records according to section 622? And if so, it says there the records must be accessible to MDOL. So is the Maine Department of Labor able to access these records under 622? What's the difference if they were able to access them in addition under 665? Am I missing something here? Or is that clear?
So 622 already applies to agricultural employers. The obligation to keep records is on employers. And yeah, those records have to be kept accessible. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to in terms of not being able to access records. I think the difference between the two, you know, they're pretty similar to each other. The major difference between the two is 665 requires the pay statements. So that requires that employees get a copy of essentially a pay stub that shows the date of the pay period, the hours worked, the total wages, and then any itemized deductions. And I should flag that itemized deductions. One of the things that we would expect to see in itemized deductions is if an employer is taking a credit, like the type that we just discussed, would be covered in that itemized deduction.
So I'll take Mike next, but just Eric, if you want to raise your hand, if you have further questions, and then I'll know that we need to call on you. Mike, go right ahead.
Again, given that the purpose of the committee is to clearly delineate what would change and what would not change if the bill is passed, I just want to emphasize something that I said last week, because I think this is very important. And that is that under federal law, which applies to, well, let me just, there is a federal statute that specifically requires all of the information required by both 622 and 665 to be kept, preserved, and provided to workers. And specifically, the statute says that each farm labor contractor, ag employer, ag association which employs any migrant agricultural worker shall, with respect to each such worker, make, keep, and preserve records for 3 years of the following information: the basis on which wages are paid, the number of piecework units earned, the number of hours worked, the total pay period earnings, the specific sums withheld and the purpose of each sum withheld, the net pay, and provide to each worker for each pay period an itemized written statement of the information required above. What that means is that there is absolutely nothing in either one of these statutes that would become applicable to farm workers if we make the change in the law, in the state law that we're talking about, that would be any more burdensome or require any additional information or any additional action by an employer. The federal law covers the waterfront here, and there would be no change on an employer's obligation in terms of record keeping.
Any comment on that, Anne, or do we want to leave that? Okay. Okay. Then we've got Arthur next.
Thanks, Jody. And just so I'm make sure that I understand this correctly, currently under state law, farm workers do not have a right to a pay stub. Is that accurate?
Not the detailed pay statement, right, that's in 665.
Thank you.
Not under state law. Yeah.
Other questions about record keeping? Okay, why don't we move on?
Okay. So broadly, just in terms of sort of record keeping practices, you know, trying to sort of synthesize a little bit what those two statutes are really saying, we are looking for accuracy more than anything else. There is no specific form or system that is required as long as the records are accurate and are maintained. The purpose really is to be able to identify who is the worker, what hours did they work, what were they paid, when were they paid. Employers are the ones who are obligated to keep those records. And so if no records exist, then we will rely on workers' records or statements, and lack of records is itself an independent violation. I do also want to point out, in terms of federal resources, USDOL actually has an app that they have created that is, I believe it's a free app that is available on their website for the purposes of record keeping and timekeeping for both employers and employees. So if anyone is interested in sort of checking out some of the resources available, that's a good place to start. Okay, so we're going to move now out of subchapter 3 and into the other statutes that are implicated by removing the exemption for individuals employed in agriculture. And so the first one there is section 601, which is rest breaks. Again, section 601 is not part of subchapter 3. It becomes applicable because it borrows its definitions and its applicability from the definitions in subchapter 3. The requirements of section 601 rest breaks is that employees be given an opportunity to take a break of at least 30 consecutive minutes after working for 6 hours, unless certain exceptions apply. We'll cover those exceptions in a moment. The employees may decline to take that break. The requirement is that they be given the opportunity, but they do not have to take it. The break may be paid or unpaid, but in order for it to be unpaid, the employee must be completely relieved of duty. Okay, and so we'll take a little look at the exemptions here. The first one is for emergencies in which there is a danger to property, life, public safety, or public health. The other is that this does not apply to any place of employment where there are fewer than 3 employees on duty at any one time. And this is important, there are 2 parts of this, they both have to be satisfied. And where the nature of the work allows frequent paid breaks of a shorter duration. So you don't have to give a 30-minute break, but folks do still have to get breaks and they have to be paid in those circumstances. And then the last exception is that 601 allows for a written agreement between an employee and employer to not require rest breaks. Keep hitting this laptop. Okay. Now, the second section that becomes applicable if the exemption is removed is section 603, limits on mandatory overtime. And basically, it's pretty straightforward. Employers may not require employees to work more than 80 hours of overtime in any consecutive 2-week period. So that really means that in any consecutive 14-day period, employers may not require employees to work more than 160 hours. It's a pretty substantial amount of time. If someone worked 14 straight days, they would be working almost 11 and a half hours a day. There are a number of different exemptions to this one. We will talk about those in a moment. But the most important exception is that we are talking about mandatory overtime. There is no limit on voluntary overtime. Okay, so the exemptions from this one, yep.
Did somebody have a question?
Yeah, just to clarify, can you just talk about, I think I'm understanding it literally, but the phrase consecutive 2-week period here. So if you work, let's just say you work 159 hours in 13 days and it rains nonstop on the 14th day, then talk to me about day, like the next day after that. Does that question make sense? I mean,
so you work 159 hours from days 1 to 13 and then don't work at all on day 14?
Right.
Then you would not.
But then going forward, how does it work then going forward? So for like your next 14 days.
I'm not sure.
So
I'm not sure what you mean.
Does the clock start again? Does the clock start again for the hours?
Oh, do you mean like, is the 14 days a continuous running time period?
Yes.
Okay. I will have to double check on that. I have not looked into that particular aspect. I will dig into that a little bit and get back to you.
Thanks.
Someone else have a question about this? No?
Just on that, I believe we did ask that question during the stakeholder meetings, and Mike Rowland did say that it was during any period, so it was a rolling thing, but there may be other interpretations.
Okay. So let's talk about the exemptions. There are a number of exemptions here. The first one is for seasonal employers. The definition of seasonal here is the same as unemployment. So I encourage you to look back at that definition from the presentation that Laura Boyette gave last week. Work in response to emergencies declared by the governor. Essential public services. There are some examples laid out in the statute, such as utilities, snow plowing, work that is necessary to protect public health or safety. In that one, it is necessary to show that the excess overtime is outside of the normal course of business. So if this is something that's happening all the time, it probably does not apply. Salary exempt employees, again, we're talking about folks who meet one of the duties tests, the professional, administrative, or executive exemptions, doctors in certain circumstances. And then there are certain types of annual maintenance where an employer has to sort of shut down operations in order to perform the maintenance, and certain kinds of activities during that type of situation can be exempt. Any questions there? Okay, so that's everything I have. I'm gonna stop sharing, but I can bring it back up if anybody needs it. Yes, anybody have any questions? Penny.
Go ahead, Penny.
Yeah, and maybe this is a little too premature, but as you go through and we're talking about hourly rates, well, how do we translate that into piecework and how that would get overlaid?
So we are going to talk about piece rate in 2 weeks. Piece rate is obviously relevant to this. Broadly speaking, piece rate, there is a way to use piece rate and comply with minimum wage. But we didn't want to get into that today because we're going to spend some significant time on that at our next meeting.
Okay.
So should we pivot to the second significantly briefer presentation and then finish that, which won't take a huge amount of time, and then we'll have kind of a block of additional time up until 2:45 to have general conversation? And I'm not clear who from DOL is presenting on those 3 or 4 slides.
I think I'm the last person standing over here, Jody, so I think I'm doing it as long as somebody can bring it up. For those of you who didn't hear, our bureau director retired on Friday. We do have a new bureau director. His first day was today, so it didn't feel fair to make him do this very short presentation. And our division director for wage and hour has been out unexpectedly. So I will walk through a couple of slides. As several of you have already said today, part of what we've been doing is really trying to dig into some of the issues that had raised some confusion, and to answer those questions, and then to start beginning to tease out what is the basic framework for the task that we have in front of us around minimum wage. Next slide. So our charge, as we've heard several times, is to develop legislation that will implement minimum wage for agricultural workers. And you've heard a lot over the past several meetings about how, what are the chapters that apply? Where is it in chapter 7 that we talk about minimum wage? So when you see the words around the simplest way to kind of look at coming up with a minimum wage for agricultural workers is to remove that current exemption under subchapter 3 and creating an exemption from overtime pay. Next. So Anne has walked through subchapter 3 several times now, coming at it from different angles. What's included? What are the particular elements of subchapter 3? If we look to that for guidance, we would be looking at having a minimum wage paid to agricultural workers. Agricultural employees would remain exempt from the time and a half pay for work over 40-hour requirement. That was how we had separated out the overtime provision, and we're going to stay focused on minimum wage. Agricultural employers would be required to keep accurate records and provide a pay statement. And then the general MDOL enforcement authority over the minimum wage would be in place. So those are the things we've been talking about, coming at it from slightly different angles. But if we're looking at what are some of the key things that we really want to dig in on, I think those are the things in subchapter 3. And then the additional elements are the items that Anne just reviewed. The rest break of offering a 30-minute break to employees after 6 hours of work. And then agricultural employers could not require employees to work more than 160 hours in any consecutive 2-week period. Agricultural employees may voluntarily work those additional hours. Yep, Penny.
Yeah, I just want to throw out a general question. Because as we go through this and we start to work on what elements would belong in this particular law, why haven't we discussed creating a whole separate chapter or a whole separate law that is just ag worker specific? So that, and I say this for many reasons, because I think this is the start of a journey that's going to go on for next several years. And that this really is the first step in defining and creating legislation and laws that are ag worker specific, so they aren't being embedded and we're trying to fit them into a current construct, that we create a new construct that takes us where we maybe need to be, which is truly understanding and embracing the fact that agricultural industry is not the same as producing widgets in a factory.
Mm-hmm.
It is creating the elements, the key elements of sustenance for humans. And so I constantly go back to, why are we trying to use an existing construct in order to address the nuances of agriculture? So I'll just throw that out, that as we travel this road, I'll continually come back to that question.
Okay.
So let me take Heather's point or question, and then, I think it may be worthy to be having a conversation at some point. I don't know what's appropriate here, but there's the what, and then there's the how. And I think you're talking about the how, but we've wanted to start with the what, and make sure we're all on the same page about the what. So go ahead, Heather.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that Penny raised the broader question. And I guess I would come at it from a slightly different angle, because if we're considering the realm of possibilities, I mean, I have a different thought than Penny as far as, carving out a separate set of standards for agricultural workers. I think that's sort of what we're trying not to do, or what the proponents of the bill in the last session were trying not to do. But I do agree that this is an essential sector that provides, critical resources for a healthy functioning society. And another important conversation that we need to have, and I think Jenny Tilton Flood has raised this as a public participant, is how do we ensure the health of the farm economy. And I think that I would just like to come at it from a different angle and not carve out the workers, but make sure that farm workers are treated equally, but that we figure out how do we make sure that farm business plans are solvent. And maybe that is through other legislation that really ensures other benefits for the farm businesses. But I would push back against creating a separate set of worker standards for farm workers.
Thank you. Remind me, Commissioner, is there another slide after this? I couldn't remember.
There is just one more,
Okay.
which is a wrap up, Jody.
Okay.
Which is basically that we do need to dig into this and have a much deeper conversation. And actually, Penny, as you raised your question, what would be really helpful to me is, as you're thinking about like what would be included for, minimum wage for farm workers, what are the elements that you think we really need to be thinking about as we're doing that? And not necessarily that we have to come up with it today, but those are the kinds of conversations that we need to have, because this is our task. Is we're supposed to be recommending how do we get minimum wage protections for agricultural workers, which is kind of a narrow, it's important and essential, but at the same time, it has some guardrails on it that your conversation is asking us to think much, much bigger than. Penny?
I think that, and I can do that very easily for you because I've been thinking about this for a number of years. Okay. And I don't disagree with where Heather's at, because I think we need to look from an industry perspective. But I do want to say, Heather, payroll is 25 to 30% of a farm business's expenses. So therefore, it should be embedded under an umbrella that is about how do we address agriculture as an industry, from a whether it be wage and labor laws, whether it be other laws. How do we address that? How do we ensure that that farms remain viable and sustainable? What I think about is that you can create a framework and plug in this element to it as its first piece of kind of, I think of the world as a Lego approach to the world. And you can plug this in and then know where we're going. First is plug it in and not know where we're going, because then we'll continue to piecemeal all of the laws that surround agriculture. So to your request, I'm more than willing to put together how I would define a framework for agriculture and how this could fit into it, and how we can stay away from the angst that's created constantly around farm workers, treatment of farm workers, payment of farm workers, all of the things around that. So I look forward to a discussion, and I'll present whatever you want.
Thank you. I want to make sure that before we move into the how, that we have exhausted the what we're talking about. And I want to just check in with the group as a whole to see if there are questions for particular, if there's any part of her presentation that you'd like to be brought back up, or if you want to take a look at the previous slide that the commissioner presented, maybe we'll back up to that anyway, just so you can have another chance to see that. Eric, go right ahead, and then Senator Tipping.
Thank you, Jody. I've got a couple questions. One, I was hoping that somebody perhaps from DOL, maybe that's you, Commissioner Fortman, can clarify for me how or if by removing the ag worker exemption, the Maine DOL will have greater access to the records of ag employers. I'm a bit confused based on what we've heard today. Is that question clear? You understand what I'm asking?
I'm trying to understand it, Eric. I think that there's some confusion, and I'd like to talk to Anne about it, and also the comments that Mike Guer raised. Before responding definitively, but I think you're saying is this going to give us greater access to records around wages or than we currently have access to? Is that what I'm?
Well, yes, sort of. I mean, in previous conversations, it seemed like there was a bit of a limit on MDOL's ability to access those records, and it's referred to here on the slide on the bottom left a little bit, general DOL enforcement authority over the minimum wage. But in hearing that the records are already required under federal law, so they do exist, we know, and that DOL can go into an employer's records at any time already, I believe, under law, and can raise a flag if they see a federal violation and then pass that to the U.S. Department of Labor. So I'm not sure what exactly would change as far as enforcement authority by removing the exemption. I just want clarity on that.
Okay, and let me get back to you because my response off the top of my head is that currently we have no enforcement authority over minimum wage. That doesn't mean that we can't request records, but we don't have that authority. But let me dig into that a little bit more.
Great, thank you. Senator Tipping.
Thank you. Another what question before we get to how. So I know the formation of this group and in the governor's veto is very clear. She wanted to introduce a new bill in December to address these issues, was very clear about support for applying the minimum wage to farm workers. I just wanted to clarify, I don't know if you can say now or if you can get it for us for the next meeting. Can you clarify if the administration specifically also supports the other, small protections that we've been talking about here in subchapter 3? So the 80-hour limit on mandatory overtime and the optional 30-minute break after 6 hours. Would appreciate, if we're in this advisory capacity, if there is a initial support for those. I mean, I assume so. It seems pretty straightforward, and that's been the conversation, but just want to get that nailed down if we can.
Great. Duly noted for sure. Okay. Let me just check on the time here. Okay, so we've got 2 more minutes. Is there any other part of Anne's presentation that you would like to go back to? Do you have any questions about the content that she raised? All right, so I'm going to ask the co-chairs here sort of where you think it would be the most productive place to spend our next 10 minutes or not spend it. And we can move to public input early and also talk about the timing of the next meeting, time of day, and whether we want to have it be in person or continue to have it remote. But I'm just trying to gauge your sense, should we be wrapping this part of it up and then providing somehow additional information about like what a bill could look like? Another thought, I'll just throw out a couple for you to consider, is that we have maybe an offline conversation with Penny to understand what she's suggesting in a little bit more detail. Yeah, so let me throw it back to you both.
I think it would be great for us to see how many folks on the attendee side of the aisle would like to participate in the public forum aspect. I think that might allow us to understand how much time and how to put to use the remaining time. Do you agree with me on that, Commissioner Fortman?
I think that sounds great, Nancy. The other thing that I would say, Eric, that was actually really helpful, the question that you asked. I think if other people have specific questions about components, if you could ask those questions so we could start making a list and getting some answers around that, that would be, I would find that helpful.
Great. So let me poll the attendees, of which there are listed 15 folks. And if you do have an interest in making a public comment or asking a question, just raise your hand and then Dylan can take you off mute. So go ahead, Jenny, in just a second, as soon as we're able to hear you. There you go.
Hi. So thank you very much. I'm driving, so trying to remember my questions, but the questions I have are really kind of rudimentary because the information's a lot and it's really great, but I just wanted clarification. I think it was included in one of the earlier meetings. If the exemption from subchapter 3 were removed by legislation, that would apply to what level of employers, like how many what size business, like how many employees would they have to have in order for all of this to be applicable, or would it apply to anyone regardless if they only have one paid employee? And is there exemption for family members? Those, I think that was covered, but I'm not sure. And I'm wondering if maybe moving forward, when we're talking about what would change for present day ag employers and ag employees, if that metric was included, because we have, as Deputy Commissioner McGrady's slide show, 96% of these businesses are family businesses and have. And then I also, whether or not what would be included would be the one. I'm confused now because my question was I was assuming that by removing the exemption that would become part and parcel of minimum wage law and the no longer having that exemption. And I just was curious about what the record keeping requirements would be to ensure that there is complicity with that. So I guess I don't know if I have a question if that's not part of that exemption being removed or not. And I feel like I really shouldn't be asking questions when I'm driving. Sorry about that.
In general, we sort of like take public comment and then, take it under advisement, but leave it entirely up to you, co-chairs, as to whether you'd like any of that responded to right now. Okay.
I'm fine with if Anne or Commissioner Fortman wanted to speak to any of that. I don't see that many other hands up. So I'm okay with that, or we could also just circle back.
I think, I don't know, Anne, it looks like you're off mute.
So I will be honest, I did not really understand the second half of the question. I think there was some something got lost in the shuffle there. I will say on the sort of first half, there is no employer size threshold that is part of subchapter 3. It applies to all employers, regardless of size. There is a separate exemption for family members who are dependent upon and reside with the employer. So you're really talking household members. That is different than the exemption for individuals employed in agriculture. And then I kind of missed what the other half of that question was.
So I will move on to another attendee, but Jenny, if you have a comment that you want to submit in writing to just ensure that the committee's work takes X under consideration and make sure that it's clear about X topic, please feel free to send that in to Dylan and we'll share that with the committee. Let me take Sean now and Dylan will take you off mute in just a second.
Hey, yeah. First of all, sorry for the confusion, everyone. Juana joined after me, so I'm just going to leave I haven't been participating, so I'm just going to leave a public comment as if I transition to being an audience member. But I did want to point out, or I wanted to bring up, listening to the discussion around subchapter 3 and specifically around the credits for housing and food. What I understood is right now the way it works is that those are governed by federal law, which means that employers can take credits for housing and food against a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. And I wanted to kind of think about the math around that, which, for example, we were talking about a couple examples where you had like a 15-cent exemption or credit per hour for like food, or I can't remember the other credit for housing we had as an example. But as an example, you could theoretically have an employer taking credits which reduce a farm worker's effective wage to, let's say, $7 an hour, say if there were 25 cents worth of housing and or food credits. $7 an hour, when you multiply that by a 40-hour work week, and then multiply that to an annual wage, comes out to $280 a week and $14,560 a year. And that $14,560 number is currently $20 lower than the 2023 federal poverty guideline for a household of one. So I did just want to note sort of the math there, as long as I'm understanding correctly what was discussed about how the credits work and how they're applied to a federal minimum wage as it currently stands. The other thing I wanted to note was that while it is true that agriculture as an industry is like a unique industry, I would also like to note that farm workers, particularly seasonal and migrant farm workers, are also unique in that they have certain unique vulnerabilities or things that they have to worry about. So for example, one thing a housing credit for an employer doesn't really take into account is that a seasonal farm worker still has to maintain a home base and housing in a sort of like a home location. So for example, at Mano Mano, we work with a lot of farm workers who have a home base in Florida. And so if they need to maintain a home base throughout the year as they're traveling for farm work up and down the East Coast, while potentially at the same time having housing being taken out of their paycheck. And that's sort of, that's kind of, but like the nature of the work is just kind of a unique vulnerability that is inherent to having a job that requires a lot of movement in between places. And then the last thing I would say is that while agriculture may not be maybe unique in comparison to other industries, farm workers still need to survive and live in the same economy as everyone else. And we all don't need to be reminded that we are in a historical housing crisis. We just went through a historical episode of inflation. And so I wanted to kind of bring that or foreground that as we're thinking about what is the actual effective minimum wage right now for farm workers, including potential credits that are taken out as deductions from their paycheck. So thank you.
Thank you. I also see Timothy Sorber's hand raised if we want to take him off mute. And there we go. Go ahead, Timothy.
Oh, thanks for having me. I was just about to say a lot of what Sean just said. So, you know, if farming has a recruiting problem, excuse me, I think it's a good idea to, at the very least, treat farm workers as every other worker. You know, how are you supposed to stay competitive if, for instance, McDonald's is hiring $17.80 to work there? How? Why would you work on a farm? You know? So it's just like, you know, and the whole overtime thing and minimum wage, it's all just like completely against like getting new people into farming, you know, because if you don't already have a farm, you're likely just going to be a farm worker if you have any interest in farming, you know, you're not going to be a farmer, you know, so if you're trying to get into farming, you have to be like a farm worker, you know, and so how are you supposed to be a farmer if you're getting ripped off all the time, you know, if you don't have overtime, if you don't have minimum wage, you know, all these basic protections afforded to literally every other industry, you know, I mean, it's simple. That's it. Just pay more.
Thank you, Timothy. I'm sorry, did I cut you off or are you all set? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I just said sure.
Okay, all right, thank you. Do we have any other members of the public that would like to make a comment? Okay. All right, well, let me then just jump to a little bit of housekeeping so we make sure we cover it before we lose people, and then turn it back to you both as to how, where we go from here.
Jody,
please. Yep, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it looks like Nolan Thompson has a question as well.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't want to ignore you twice, Nolan. There you go. Go right ahead.
I'm unmuting myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I've been sitting through here, and I've also read stuff in the Portland paper, and I read the legislative notes. The one thing I have somewhat of curiosity about is, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I did step away a couple little times because nature called. And I'm sure it's complicated, but when I think about people working overtime, doing those hours, what's in there for accidents or exhaustion, or like, I'll just make it short, health care of any sort. So if somebody gets ill and then in that, how would that fit into the formula in regards to like housing? So if they pay out for an emergency visit, would that be included in that formula for minimum wage? Or so I was just curious about that. I don't want to bring healthcare into the whole discussion, but if somebody pays out for that, could they figure that into the minimum, to the wage formula?
Great. Thank you for raising that point. We won't be sort of answering questions right now, but we take it.
And that seems like that would be a take to the back room discussion.
Great. Thank you. Well, so let's just circle to this issue of the next meeting. You've heard a number of times, Anne and Commissioner Fortman mentioned that there will be two presentations, complementary presentations at the next meeting around piecework. One from the Department of Labor and one from Eric, committee member Eric, and I think Holly as well. And we're coordinating those presentations so they're complementary and they provide as broad information about that particular issue as possible so that we're sure we cover that. One question was, at the moment, that meeting is on the books as a remote meeting, and we can either keep it as is, or we can provide the option for a hybrid meeting if others would like to, if there is a bulk of people that would like to gather in person to do that. We have a room tentatively reserved in Augusta to do that. If you all like, but I need reactions. Maybe the easiest way is a show of hands for those who would be interested in potentially being in person for that meeting. Right, so I'm not seeing, and obviously all staff and co-chairs were completely willing to do whatever the group likes. We want to be respectful of the amount of time we're asking you, but we also appreciate that sometimes communications are easier in person. I'm not seeing a critical mass that would suggest that we shift it, but let me turn that decision over to the co-chairs.
I'm not seeing the critical mass either, Jody.
Okay. Well, then what we'll do is, sorry, Laura, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. I just know that it seemed, I don't know if we should it was a request that we do it, so I don't know if we should allow somebody to do a pitch about why they thought it was important to meet in person. So I want to just, one of the committee members thought it was important for us to do this in person, so I just want to make sure they have an opportunity to say why they thought it was important to do that. So, Eric, I don't know if you or Holly want to
put you on the spot there.
Yeah.
I just feel that in-person meetings are a much better way to share information and get input and have meaningful conversations. But I also understand that, this committee is asking a lot of folks' time, and if people don't want to travel, I totally get it. And thanks for allowing me to make the presentation and the request out there.
Okay, well then what we'll do is between now and then we'll coordinate with Eric, you and Holly, so that we're sure we provide as broad information as possible, and then whatever is presented in terms of slide decks will also be provided to the committee immediately afterwards, so that you'll have that information. The other question that came up, or the topic that came up at the last meeting, was around time of day and wanting to make sure that we either or both hold one of our remaining meetings at a different time of day that might make it more accessible, particularly for the farming community, maybe in the evening. And then another topic brought up was, having an in-person elsewhere in the state to make it easier for some people to travel to that. I think the context of that was, once we have kind of a body, a document, if you will, a draft of something, to get reactions, to provide the opportunity for people to react to that in person. We're not at that stage yet, so we do have the meetings scheduled. So one possibility is that the planning team that always gets together a day or two after these meetings, that we make a recommendation to the rest of the committee as to which meeting would make sense, and maybe come up with a couple of ideas of location to get your reaction to that at the next meeting. I'm winging it, so.
Jody, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think that makes a lot more sense. I think, having something more concrete to react to it is a little bit better than something still amorphous. Certainly open to the committee members disagreeing with me on that, but I think we can propose a couple of options in the near term. And I do agree with you that we did receive pretty clear feedback that as the committee gets closer to its final recommendations, that there be an opportunity for public input that is different than our daytime meetings in Augusta.
Okay, well then, when we get back together 2 weeks from now, we will have some suggestions for reaction. And in the meantime, we'll be coordinating with Eric. Maybe we'll have an offline conversation with Penny just to understand a little bit more about what her thinking was there. However, not wanting to kind of elevate that idea more so, for instance, than Heather's kind of counterpoint there. So we won't go necessarily far down that road without all of your input on that. What have I forgotten?
The only other thing, and I have no idea how it worked, Jody, but we did offer the Bangor Career Center as a spot for the public to engage in the remote meeting. I'll circle back with folks and see if anyone took advantage of that, but that was one of our remote meeting policy requirements, is that there be a location available to the public with a computer, so that public who didn't necessarily have access to computers could participate in these meetings if they wanted to. And we will continue to do that for remote meetings.
Great, thank you. So any final comments from the co-chairs before I think we adjourn?
Just appreciate everyone's attention. Jody, thanks for keeping us on time and on track. As always, if there is feedback, questions, concerns, additional information you all would like to share as members, please don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you for your attention and good discussion and questions today. And thank you, Anne.
Yeah, thank you, Anne.
Okay, I echo what Nancy said, and again, please, if the public has any comments or questions, we do look at written comments, and anything that we receive will be circulated to the entire committee. So,
great.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you, Heidi.